John 3:16 is one of the most popular. It almost always comes up. Philippians 4:13 is really popular. Along with other ones that are mentioned, we almost always can hear the 23rd Psalm. And I've never tabulated the answers, but I would have to say that it falls probably within the top 5 to 10 of the favorites that I ever hear people say. And in those discussions, when we ask that question about why is the Bible passage your favorite, the 23rd Psalm is one where the answers usually fall within the framework of, well, it's such a comforting passage. And it should be. It is. I think it's partially designed to be just that. And we most commonly hear this passage read at funerals. In fact, Neil this morning, I said to him that I'm going to be preaching mainly out of the 23rd Psalm. And he said, "Is there a funeral?" Because that's kind of how we think of this. And the beauty of this psalm consists mostly of that calm assurance that we find in its words of God's all-sufficiency. And there is no way to miss the fullness of God's love that is all throughout it, even though the words God's love don't appear once in the text, but it's understood in the full assurance of his care and protection. The Lord is my shepherd. Is there anyone? Oh, it disappeared. Is there anyone who has this memorized that would be willing to come up and share it? And it doesn't matter if you did this in the NIV, the ESV. I'm going to use ESV today. But is there anybody who has this memorized and would be willing to come up and share it? And come on up. Green, Matt. This is from memory, and it takes a lot of confidence, so I'm glad you're willing to do this. Go ahead and share it with everyone.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lay down in green pastures. He restoreth my soul.
You're doing fine. He restores my soul. He leads.
He leadeth me beside still waters.
He restores my soul. He leads me in paths.
He leadeth me in the path of still waters.
Righteousness. They didn't hear me.
Righteousness.
All right. Zach, are you done? It's hard to do it from memory when you get up in front of people. Thank you for being willing to do that, Ann. I appreciate that. I know when we started this series, I had a lot of people terrified that every week I was just going to call somebody at random to come up here. And thank you very much. I know how hard that is. I've messed up a few when I've tried to do them from memory up here as well. But thank you for doing that. I want us to read the entire psalm. She was to where it cuts off as far as the memory work. I want us to read this together this morning. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And there is such confidence to be gained from this psalm. And this psalm is attributed to David, who is one of the most well-known shepherds in the entire Bible. He was the shepherd boy who protected his father's sheep by slaying a bear and a lion. He was a shepherd boy who slew the giant Philistine named Goliath. He was the shepherd boy who was anointed to be king when he was still young, and he was a shepherd boy who became the greatest king Israel had ever known. David knew a thing about sheep and about shepherding, and that's where we're going to start today, talking about shepherds. And as Mark Moore pointed out, as you have probably heard at church, even if you only attend church at Christmas, you've probably heard this about shepherds. Shepherding was not a high-class vocation. Shepherds were among the lowliest class of citizens in society. They were not respected, in large part because, well, they were filthy. They were disgustingly dirty as shepherds, and they lived with the sheep. They were outdoors with the sheep all day and all night, and they didn't come into the towns very often, and whenever they did, it wasn't hard to distinguish which one were the shepherds because they smelled. They smelled like sheep. To the Jewish nation, the shepherds were also ritually unclean because they were the ones who had to slaughter the sheep, and they were the ones who aided in the birth of the lambs, and which according to the Jewish laws and customs, it rendered them unclean. But it wasn't just the Jewish nation who had this attitude, kept the shepherds at this low end of society. And Mark Moore pointed this out in Genesis chapter 46. And when Joseph's family arrived in Egypt because of the famine, and that's where you would go to get food because that's kind of how God prepared it. And Joseph told his family, stay in Goshen. Because they needed to keep this space between themselves and the Egyptians because their livelihood would be an offense to the Egyptians. And in explaining this to his family, Joseph tells them that shepherds are detested by the Egyptians, or they are an abomination to the Egyptians. So as we read through the scriptures, it seems somewhat strange in the Bible that shepherding or shepherds themselves, who were some of the most disrespected people in all of Bible times, are the metaphor that is used to define God and leadership that should always be respected. Dr. Lynn Anderson wrote a book called They Smell Like Sheep, and in it he tells the story of a friend of his who understood this dichotomy that we have between the disconnect that we have today to what shepherds look like, because it's not a common career for people today. And then to understand that they're also hated a lot of times by their culture, his friend suggested to Dr. Anderson that he find a more contemporary alternative to communicate this spiritual leadership idea, so people can understand better what he's talking about. And accepting that the shepherding metaphor does sound strange, Dr. Anderson made that somewhat of a goal. He carefully considered that suggestion. And he began to search, and albeit in vain, for a contemporary alternative to explain what shepherding is all about. And he eventually concluded he couldn't do it, and he explains his conclusion this way. I can't find any figure equivalent to the shepherd idea in our modern urban world. Besides, if I dropped the shepherd flock idea, I would have to tear out about 500 pages of my Bible. And I don't know if it would be 500 pages, but shepherds and sheep and the relationship between the two, how they are alluded to, and they're used as examples in spiritual leadership in over half the books of the New Testament in our Bibles. Many of the great leaders, continuing on with that theme, many of the great leaders throughout the Bible were shepherds. David, as I mentioned, he was a shepherd. Abraham, the first patriarch of our faith, he was a shepherd. Jacob and his 12 sons were all shepherds. Moses and the prophet Amos, they were shepherds. There's no shortage of shepherds who led and or ministered to the nation of Israel throughout the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the lowly shepherd, the societal outcast, they were the ones whom the angel army announced the birth of Jesus to. We hear that at Christmas. And they were the first ones who told others about the birth of Jesus. And Jesus uses shepherd allegories in the John's Gospel in the 10th chapter, declaring himself, as Dennis shared this morning, he is the good shepherd. And in the 10th chapter, Jesus begins to weave together the familiar symbols of the shepherding vocation, which was embedded in the culture of the people, with the Old Testament theology about being a leader, being a shepherd. And if we look at the 9th chapter of John, Jesus is coming out of a contentious, confrontational discussion about who he is with the Pharisees. Now, in the 10th chapter, he is using language that they understand. They understand it better than we do. They understand it culturally and also within the backdrop of the Old Testament to attribute to himself. Jesus does. He attributes to something the Old Testament ascribes only to God. In the first several verses, Jesus was using figures of speech to get his point across, and then he says more clearly in verse 7, so Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. And when we hear that, unless you've heard people talk about this verse and what Jesus means, we hear that, and we oftentimes think of a swinging, sometimes it says gate, a swinging gate or a door that we open and close and that we go through with ease. But a shepherd, what this refers to, what a shepherd would actually do, would lay their body down where the opening is to the pen where the sheep spent the night to protect the sheep from wandering off as they would, or from the approach of predators or thieves. And this is one of the main responsibilities of the shepherd, to protect his sheep. And we're not going to read all of John 10 today, but this is much of the context of what Jesus is saying, that the shepherd protects his sheep. In verse 11, Jesus got more direct with them about what he is saying, and they wouldn't have missed what he states here. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, for his sheep. Again, he points out the responsibility of protecting his flock, protecting his sheep. To call himself the good shepherd, that also, it means something. It means a great deal. The good shepherd has always been a position that is occupied by God and God alone throughout the Old Testament, and was one that was promised of the Messiah in Ezekiel 34. They should have all known Jesus was declaring himself at this point. He's stating clearly to them, I am the Messiah. This is the same kind of description we see elsewhere in the New Testament. The Apostle Peter writes this in his first letter. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. And Peter is writing this to the church. Again, that's us. That includes us. We were lost. We were wandering. At one time, all of us were wandering and lost. But now, we have come to our salvation through Jesus Christ. We have returned to our shepherd. This is another responsibility of a shepherd. A shepherd leads their sheep. They protect their sheep and they lead their sheep. On their own, sheep will eat grass in one area and they will keep eating grass in that area and they will keep eating grass in that area until there is no more grass and they have nothing left to eat on their own. As the church, we need to recognize that, excuse me, it's only through the guidance of the shepherd that we are kept safe. We can't come to salvation on our own. Not a one of us can. It is only through the guidance of Jesus that we have moved from one way that we lived before to another way that as a church, as followers,